Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's explainer. We are rewinding the clock to explore what is arguably one of the most critical crossroads in history, the 19th century Indian Renaissance. And honestly, this wasn't just a minor shift in thinking. It was a profound, massive awakening that completely set the trajectory for the subcontinent's future.
Because, to truly grasp modern India, we absolutely have to understand this specific awakening. It served as this huge catalyst for change, taking the form of major social-religious reform movements. But it's important to realize this awakening didn't just move in one straight unified line. It actually branched out into three highly distinct ideological trends: Reformation, Revivalism, and Status Quoism. And each of these paths offered a completely different vision for the future.
So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with the Renaissance as a whole, then track those three distinct philosophical branches: Reformation under Ram Mohan Roy, Revivalism with Dayanand Saraswati, and Status Quoism led by Radhakant Dave. And finally, we'll see exactly where those roots of Indian nationalism lead us.
Starting off with Section 1, the 19th century Renaissance, a crossroads of ideology. Let's set the stage for this immense ideological battleground of the 1800s.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the original handwritten notes from our source material. They perfectly divide the Renaissance into these three paths we just mentioned. These weren't just abstract floating ideas. They were highly organized, deeply motivated movements, all actively competing to define the identity of millions of people.
Let's move right into Section 2, Reformation, Ram Mohan Roy and the Path of Synthesis. He's our first major figure, born back in 1772 in Radhanagar, Bengal.
And before we even dig into his actual philosophy, just look at the prestige this guy commanded. Akbar II actually bestowed the title of Raja on him before sending him on a crucial mission to England to negotiate pension issues with the British king. It was actually in London that Roy eventually passed away in 1833. But man, in the decades before his death, he set some truly monumental changes into motion.
So, what was he all about? Well, Roy's approach was fundamentally about synthesis. After studying numerous religious texts, he arrived at the doctrine of divine monotheism. He believed heavily in blending Indian tradition with Western culture to build up this scientific temperament and rationality among Indians. And notice his philosophical dividing line here. It's super specific. He rejected what he saw as the mysticism of the Puran, but he fully embraced the Vedas and Upanishads as complete scientific philosophy. To get these ideas out there, he established the Atmiya Sabha around 1814, and later the famous Brahma Samaj in 1828. Plus, he was a total pioneer in journalism, pushing his message through newspapers like Samvad Kaumudi and books like Tuhfat-ul-Muwahhidin, which translates to A Gift to Monotheists.
And these weren't just thought experiments. These philosophies translated into massive, real-world action. Looking directly at the source notes here, we see his fierce opposition to things like the caste system, child marriage, and polygamy. But his absolute biggest crusade was against the Satipratha. Through sheer persistence and relentless rational argument, he successfully persuaded Lord William Bentinck to pass Regulation 17 in 1829, officially declaring the practice of sati illegal.
But wait, Roy's vision went way beyond just religious reform. He was looking at the total infrastructure of society. Economically, he literally demanded an industrial revolution in India, setting up heavy industries and what's known as economic reform from above. He also pushed for property rights for women and fixed rents for peasants. On the political side, he championed liberal Western philosophy. We're talking separation of powers, the rule of law, and he vehemently opposed press restrictions that were imposed by John Adams. Ultimately, he just wanted more Indians actively included in the administration. However, as we see time and time again in history, movements often struggle to maintain unity once they lose their founder. After Roy's death in 1833, Devendranath Tagore initially took up the mantle. But divisions quickly emerged between Tagore, who viewed Brahmoism as essentially Hinduism, and Keshab Chandra Sen, who saw it as an entirely different religion. This caused a massive split. Sen goes off and establishes the Brahma Samaj of India in 1866 and even pushes the government to pass the Brahmo Marriage Act in 1872, which fixed the marriageable age. But then, in a twist of supreme irony, Sen actually violated his very own act by marrying his underage daughter to the Maharaja of Cooch Behar. Unsurprisingly, this caused a mass exodus of his followers. They left and established the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj in 1878.
Let's move to Section 3 and see how this builds into our second ideological path, Revivalism. This was championed by Dayanand Saraswati, who was originally named Mulshankar, born in 1824 over in Gujarat.
The contrast between our first two figures is just striking. While Ram Mohan Roy looked outward for a synthesis of East and West, Dayanand Saraswati looked exclusively backward. He believed in the absolute cultural superiority of Vedic society. He completely, unequivocally rejected the Western white man's burden hypothesis, that whole idea that the West needed to civilize the rest of the world. To Saraswati, Vedic society was already the ideal evil-free society, which is a philosophy he laid out in incredible detail in his influential book, Satyarth Prakash.
This right here became the ultimate rallying cry of his movement, Back to Vedas. This simple but incredibly powerful slogan launched the Shuddhi movement, which aimed to create a homogeneous society by reconverting Hindus who had converted to other religions. Now, this is a truly critical moment in our explainer, because as the sources note, while this movement birthed a really strong sense of cultural nationalism, it also, at the exact same time, created communalism.
Just like Roy, Saraswati had very distinct economic and political goals, but his methods were totally different. To make India economically self-sufficient, he advocated for Swadeshi, meaning using local goods and small-scale handicrafts. He coined the phrase Gram Uday Bharat Uday, meaning village empowerment is the empowerment of India. He pushed for root development of democracy through local self-government and started the Goraksha movement to protect cows, framing it as a vital part of the Indian economic system. To push all these ideas, he established the Arya Samaj in 1875, laying the absolute groundwork for economic nationalism. It was this very Arya Samaj background that would later heavily influence extremist leaders in the Indian National Congress like Lal, Bal, and Paul.
He was also the very first person to use the word Swaraj, delivering another defining punchy slogan, India for Indians. Notice the radical political departure here. Remember, Roy wanted Indians included in the British administration. Saraswati? He wanted power directly in the hands of local Indian self-government. No middleman.
Yet, much like the Brahma Samaj, the Arya Samaj faced a pretty severe fracture after its founder's death. Following Saraswati's passing in Ajmer in 1883, the group split, primarily along educational lines. One section, led by Lala Hansraj, went on to establish the DAV College in Lahore, while another section, led by Swami Shraddhanand, established a traditional Sanskrit Gurukul at Haridwar.
Which brings us to Section 4, Status Quoism, Radhakant Dev, and Resisting Change. We've seen Reformation, we've seen Revivalism. Now we arrive at the third and final path.
Radhakant Dev founded the Dharma Sabha in 1828, and it was created as a direct counter-movement. The philosophy of status quoism was fiercely anti-Brahmo Samaj. Its sole aim was to preserve Indian culture exactly as it was. In stark defiance to reformers like Roy, this meant openly supporting practices like child marriage and the sati pratha. The Dharma Sabha promoted total changelessness and rigidity. By seeking to block all reforms, the source texts indicate this movement created a deep community consciousness, which ultimately fed right into the rise of communalism.
Moving to our final section, the roots of Indian nationalism, freedom, and partition. So, the crucial point is, how do these three distinct 19th century movements impact the massive historical events of the 20th century? Let's bring all three paths together.
Take a look at this brilliant primary source flowchart. It visually maps out the entire journey we just took together, explicitly showing what each of those distinct paths eventually evolved into.
Let's unpack the data derived from that chart. The Reformation branch of Roy built the engines of political and economic nationalism. Revivalism under Saraswati fueled cultural, political, and economic nationalism, but it brought the unintended consequence of communalism. And status quoism under Dev fueled cultural nationalism while also heavily feeding into communalism. So what's the result? In the 20th century, that nationalism, the political and economic push, led directly to India's freedom. But the communalism, which was fostered by the rigid boundaries of revivalism and status quoism, led directly to partition.
Which leaves us with this huge, provocative final thought. Were the very forces that woke a nation up the exact same forces that ultimately divided it? Did the socio-religious movements of the 19th century inevitably pave the way for both India's freedom and its partition? It's a pretty powerful reminder of how ideologies from the past always cast incredibly long shadows into the future. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning the roots of the history we think we know.